Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about emotions. And let's start with what is an emotion. We all know them, we have them. This is our internal states that we infer in ourselves and others, and also in animals. We can't directly observe our internal feelings. If we're wanting to do a study, you can't really do an MRI scan or a blood test or something that would let you know how the person is feeling. But instead, we use operational definitions, which means we figure out how we are going to define a particular emotion for a research study, let's say, and maybe if you've taken a research methods class before, you've learned the term operational definition. But we could say, well, if someone runs away from something, that means they're scared. Or if somebody starts to cry, that means they're sad. Again, we can't really measure their internal feelings, we can't observe them, but from what we see behaviorally, we can decide what emotion we believe they're feeling. So it's a subjective mental state. It's usually, emotions are usually accompanied by distinct behaviors. Like I said, if you're scared, maybe you run away. If you're sad, you cry. If you're find something funny, you laugh. Um, as well as involuntary physiological changes. These are physiological changes that happen in your body. For instance, let's go back to scared. When you're scared, your heart starts beating faster, your breathing starts happening quicker, um, and those happen without your, it's not your choice, it's involuntary. And these physical sensations, these physiological changes are the result of the activation of our autonomic nervous system. We talked about the autonomic nervous system or automatic nervous system in the beginning of the class. And we have two divisions of your autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight system, preparing the body for action, doing those things that I talked about, perhaps when you're angry or scared, of your heart beating fast and your breathing coming quicker. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, the kind of opposite division, which prepares your body to relax and recuperate. And so typically we're in this parasympathetic mode, and then when we're having a strong emotion, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. So theories to explain emotion, and there are a number of theories, and let me actually go here, sorry, and we'll go back. The kind of long believed or folk theory is that something happens, there's some kind of stimulus, you perceive the stimulus, you see, wow, there was this explosion, you get an emotion like fear, and fear leads to a specific pattern of autonomic nervous system arousal, like your heart starts to beat really fast. This is the way people typically think about emotion. But we actually find that it doesn't occur that way, even though maybe this is the way that makes sense um, in our minds. Research has shown, and this is our first theory, the James-Lange theory, that what actually happens is an event happens, you have some kind of cognitive appraisal, and then your action, either you, if this was this explosion that we just saw, you either run away, and you get the physiological response, and it's due to that, then you start to feel the emotion of being scared. So it's the autonomic arousal and your actions, like running away, that comes before your emotional feeling. So you experience fear because you run away. Your feelings are aroused or caused by your actions. All right, and the cognitive awareness is separate. So let's go back to this slide here. Here's our James-Lange theory, where you have a stimulus, same. You perceive that stimulus as dangerous, and that in turn starts this autonomic nervous system pattern of arousal. And because of that, you then experience fear. It's the opposite of kind of the way we typically think of it, or maybe as a layperson, we think of how we see emotions. But this is what one of the theories that has been proven, or supported scientifically. So that's the James-Lange theory. Autonomic reaction triggers feelings. There's also the Cannon-Bard theory here, where again you have a stimulus, you perceive the stimulus as dangerous, and then these two things happen at the same time. The general autonomic arousal and then the particular emotion experienced. All right, so that those two things are simultaneous. Schachter's theory, this is a very famous study that emotional labels are attributed to sensations of physiological arousal, and which emotion we feel depends on the context. And so to do this study, they injected participants, so participants volunteered to be in the study, and they injected them with epinephrine, which activates the sympathetic nervous system. So you get this injection and all of a sudden your heart starts beating and your breath comes faster and you get all of that sympathetic activity. And you can read in your textbook, but the short story is that some people were told the injection would affect their heart rate, and others were told it would have no effect. And so those who were told the injection would affect their heart rate didn't have any kind of emotional arousal. They got an injection, they were told, hey, this injection is going to make your heart start beating faster, and so they just expected that. But those who were not told that the injection would affect their heart had an emotional response, that those physiological changes, they didn't know why their body was physiologically changing, and so they interpret it as an emotion. And their emotional response depended on the attitude of the person who they were with. And so they had confederates. Those are people who are in the study, but they don't they're part of like the research team, but the person who's getting the injection does not realize or does not know they're part of the research team. So if this man here got this injection and wasn't told that that injection was going to start a sympathetic nervous system response, then he starts to feel his heart beating and starting to feel this emotional response. And if he's next to an angry person, then they start to experience an angry emotion. That those physiological responses are attributed to an emotion, and depending on who the person was with, that context or their emotional response depended on that person's attitude. And so this experiment showed that the autonomic response can intensify our emotions. And then the cognitive analysis also affects which emotion we experience. So if you're with a playful kind of confederate, then you're having a very kind of joyful type of, or interpreting those feelings to a joyful kind of response. Interesting study. This is why lie detectors are somewhat problematic, because lie detectors just detect activity in your sympathetic nervous system. You're all hooked up and they look at your heart rate and your breathing rate and your galvanic skin response, that's your sweating, and it's basically measuring your activation of your sympathetic nervous system. But lie detectors can't differentiate between emotions. Why is your sympathetic nervous system um, being activated? Is it because you're lying, stressed out because you're lying, or are you stressed out because you're in the situation where you have a lie detector, you're taking a lie detector test and you're actually very nervous about it because you're innocent? It doesn't really differentiate. And so there are actually lots of research, very interesting research, about trying to find areas in the brain that activate specifically when someone is lying. And so maybe in the future we'll be able to do fMRI studies or PET studies, PET scans that would actually be able to pinpoint when a person is lying. But our traditional lie detector tests aren't great in that way. In terms of emotions, it's been suggested that there are a basic set of emotions that underlie all of our feelings. Oh, look at these faces here. And there's some controversy or some differences in opinion about what those basic emotions are. Here are some of the ones that are pretty universal: anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, surprise, contempt, and embarrassment. The contempt and embarrassment ones are included in the core group. They're interpreted similarly across many cultures, meaning if you show these types of faces or facial expressions to people of different cultures, they will react or respond in the same way and say, yes, this person is happy, and yes, this person is sad. And so we sort of seem to understand these facial expressions cross-culturally. Of course, there are some isolated groups, this is not 100%, that don't agree on the expressions, particularly of surprise and disgust. How do we make facial expressions? They're mediated by muscles, cranial nerves, and different pathways in the central nervous system. We have two categories of facial muscles. There's the superficial facial muscles. Those attach between points of facial skin and allow us to make different facial expressions that things like smiles and moving our face a little bit to create the facial expressions. And then our deep facial muscles, they attach to bone and they produce larger movements like chewing, moving your jaw, things like that. And the facial muscles are innervated by two cranial nerves. We've got the facial cranial nerve 7 and the motor branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is 5. Those all help us make our facial expressions. Another interesting theory regarding emotions is the facial feedback hypothesis, which suggests that sensory feedback from our facial expressions can affect our mood. And again, this supports the James-Lange theory that it's first the behavior that happens and then the emotion follows. And so people have performed this task. This is an experiment that's been done many times where you're either asked to hold a pencil, you can see there above your upper lip, or between your teeth. And when you hold the pencil between your teeth, you can't help but sort of make a smile in your facial expression, and sort of a bit of a frowning face when you're putting the pencil above your upper lip. And so people perform this task where they have and they feel a stronger emotion based on which facial expression they were doing. People putting the pencil between their teeth when asked or doing a task felt happier than those who had to balance the pencil above their upper lip. So the facial expression, putting your face into this smiling kind of position, even though they weren't particularly smiling for any reason, made them happier as they were doing a task. Interestingly, Botox injections, which paralyze your facial muscles, that's how we don't, they get rid of those wrinkles by paralyzing your facial muscles, cause people to have less intense emotions. Kind of interesting. So again, first the behavior and then the emotion. Brain circuits for emotions. We know that if you electronically stimulate, put an electrode in different parts of the brain, we can produce emotional effects. And we'll talk about this particularly when we talk about drug use, but brain self-stimulation, so with animals, can actually put an electrode in part of their brain, and every time they press a specific lever or something in their cage, it will get a little, they'll get an electrical stimulation in that particular brain area. And it's found that when that electrode is inserted into a particular brain area, rats will work to keep pressing that lever to keep getting the electrical stimulation, thinking that the thinking there is that electrode is in a part of the brain that is giving them a happy or rewarding kind of emotion. So rats will press a lever for electrical stimulation in certain brain areas. And the brain sites that support this self-stimulation are mostly subcortical. This medial forebrain bundle, which we can see here, it's this bundle of nerves, and again, we're in subcortically, so under the cortex, in the white matter. That's the tract that rises from the midbrain through the hypothalamus and affects many different self-stimulation sites, so sites that we believe lead to pleasurable emotions. Probably the most famous of these and most talked about, particularly in more of an intro class, site for self-stimulation and what we call reward. Reward pathway is this brain area called the nucleus accumbens. And this is an important target, here we go, nucleus accumbens, for axons of the medial forebrain bundle. And these axons release dopamine and seem to produce very pleasurable feelings. And so rats will work very hard for stimulation in terms of they'll press that lever really hard for electrical stimulation of the nucleus accumbens. And we're going to talk about this area in more detail when we talk about drug abuse, since we think it's this dopamine release, particularly in the nucleus accumbens, that makes drug use so pleasurable. Brain lesions also affect emotions. Decorticate rage, that's a sudden intense rage we can see in dogs whose cortex has been removed, suggesting that emotion is subcortical, below the cortex. And the cortex, right, the outer covering, inhibits that rage. And so if you remove the cortex, then all you're left with is kind of this pure emotional rage that's not inhibited or controlled by the cortex. Limbic system, this is another important term with emotion. This is a set of interconnected brain regions, and we've got this here, that are all important in emotional processing. And Kluver-Bucy syndrome, that's characterized by dramatic reduction of fear and anxiety following bilateral amygdala damage. We believe the amygdala is important in fear and anxiety, and when you bilaterally damage the amygdala, you get this reduction in fear and anxiety. Oh, and here we go, the amygdala, important for fear. Oh, look at that poor scared turtle. Fear is usually temporary, just in terms of terminology, whereas anxiety is more long-lasting. Again, we're going to talk about fear and anxiety towards the end of the class when we discuss different disorders, anxiety being one of them. And we see studies of fear conditioning. In studies of fear conditioning, the amygdala, which is in the temporal lobe, is a key structure in fear. And so when we do classical conditioning, and we'll talk more in detail about classical conditioning in our section on learning, but basically you're teaching every time you make a sound, let's say there's a sound in this rat's cage, then the bottom of the floor gets electrified and this poor rat gets a shock. Eventually, every time they hear this sound, they're going to produce a fear response. And that's a very basic idea of classical conditioning. We're going to talk about all the details of that soon. But it's the idea of pairing a sound, something kind of neutral, with something that automatically gets a response, which is a shock. And eventually, if you pair those two things enough, the sound and the shock, the sound and the shock, eventually all the animal has to do is hear the sound and they start to get afraid because they're going to have the shock. Well, the amygdala appears to be an important brain area for establishing these types of fear responses, and that and the amygdala becomes really important in an animal experiencing fear or a person. Other brain areas and emotion, this is very complicated. This is another part of biopsych where what we know is probably less than what we don't know. And there's no simple one-to-one relation between a specific emotion and changed activity in particular regions as of yet. This is something people are studying and trying to learn. You know, is there one specific part of the brain that activates when we're happy? Well, we don't really think so as of yet, but that's not to say we won't find that as research goes on and on. We see as examples, feeling love can bilaterally increase activity in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex and decrease activity in the posterior cingulate and prefrontal cortices. So you can see that feeling love leads to increased activity in two areas, decreased activity in two areas, kind of this pattern of response that's all over the brain. And a study comparing brain activation during sadness, happiness, and anger and fear showed activation of the insulate, cingulate, and prefrontal cortex, where we get kind of a lot of activity in many parts of the brain. We see what parts of the brain seem to be important in emotion, but pinpointing maybe through an fMRI or MRI scan, oh, this person is experiencing happiness or sadness. Maybe in certain research studies we can do it, but in terms of a clinical way of pattern of response, we're certainly not there yet. Although there's research going on, and one day it would be wonderful if we could find that out. I did want to talk about the right hemisphere and emotion. The right hemisphere seems to be more responsive to emotional stimuli than the left, so we talk about lateralization. Both hemispheres process emotion, but right hemisphere more so. The right hemisphere is especially activated by unpleasant emotions. If you inactivate the right hemisphere or have a lesion to the right hemisphere, people don't experience strong emotions, sometimes can't even remember feeling them. Crying or laughter activates more so the right amygdala than the left. Noting emotional expression in other people's faces also activates your right temporal cortex. So if you're looking at pictures and trying to say what, you know, if the research task is what emotion is that person feeling, and you're showing a bunch of pictures. Left hemisphere damage. So if someone has a left hemisphere stroke, that allows them actually to be better at detecting emotional expressions, because you basically just have your right hemisphere working. The right hemisphere is particularly good at emotional detection. So after a left hemisphere stroke, again, your left hemisphere is damaged, your right hemisphere, your very emotional hemisphere, is still working. That very often leads to depression, because after a left hemisphere stroke, right, typically a person is left with quite a bit of perhaps behavioral damage in terms of maybe being paralyzed or having weakness on one side, maybe having difficulty with language. And that is a difficult situation. And so the right hemisphere, the very emotional hemisphere, is the one that's working, and we're more likely to see depression in those patients. However, after a right hemisphere stroke, so the emotional hemisphere is damaged, the person may still have the same problems in terms of having trouble walking, being paralyzed, being in the hospital, but their emotions are much more ambivalent, because that right hemisphere, that emotional hemisphere, is the part that's damaged. Aggression. Aggressive behavior is intended to cause pain or harm to others. You can see intermale aggression, that's between two males of the same species. Testosterone increases aggression in many species, although in humans the effect is less clear. But there are research studies that suggest that males fight more and get arrested more than females. Testosterone is highest in males between 15 to 25 years old. That's also when they have the highest testosterone levels. High levels of testosterone are associated with more rape and murder than nonviolent crimes. And injections of testosterone cause women to increase heart rate when viewing angry faces. So it does seem that testosterone does have is a key player kind of in aggression. Neurotransmitters and brain areas associated with aggression. The release of serotonin typically inhibits aggression. So the most aggressive monkeys show lowest serotonin levels. Higher serotonin levels will seem to inhibit aggression. And the ventromedial hypothalamus, that's a part of the brain that seems to be involved in aggressive behavior. Maternal aggression, another type of aggression that's in mothers defending their nest or offspring, seems to be controlled by circuits in that ventromedial hypothalamus, as well as the preoptic area and the premammillary nuclei. Now, as you can see, as we're going through this class, it's very uncommon to have one action, like let's say maternal aggression, controlled by one single part of the brain. It's typically by multiple parts of the brain in some kind of a circuit. So we would say ventromedial hypothalamus, I would say, is the key brain area here, but there are other areas involved as well. Psychopaths, we're going to talk about this when we talk about psychological disorders, but these are people who have very little feelings of remorse when they commit violent crimes. Okay, so we'll get back to that later in the semester. Stress, let's talk briefly about stress as an emotion. That's one we all know. Stress triggers the release of cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone and is released from the adrenal glands, adrenal cortex and adrenal glands. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are also released during stress from the adrenal medulla. And all of this, epinephrine, norepinephrine, boost your heart rate, your breathing in preparation for action. So we've got our hormone, basically cortisol being the stress hormone. And brief stress, what we find might actually strengthen your immune system. But chronic levels of stress result in high cortisol levels, which can be harmful to the immune system. So when you're going through stress, we've got our adrenal glands. They may release, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is our stress response. And we find that brief stress can actually be helpful and strengthening to the animal, but chronic long-term stress where a person or an animal can't get out of a stressful situation and you're constantly releasing this into your body can actually be harmful to the immune system. Stress immunization, mild stress early in life seems to improve resiliency to later stress. So in rats, they find that the early stress experience was beneficial, but only if mothers comforted the pups right afterward. Pups who received little maternal attention showed greater stress responses in adults due to changes in the expression of adrenal steroid receptors in the brain. We call this epigenetic regulation, where we actually see a change in the expression of a gene. And it's seen that suicide victims who had a childhood history of abuse or neglect exhibited these same epigenetic changes. in adrenal steroid receptors as seen in the rats. So we can actually see changes, genetic changes from stress very early on, and this stress response is mediated or is changed by whether there was some kind of comfort after, versus by a mom versus being ignored, having to deal with that stress and getting no maternal attention. And stress activates many body responses. And so this is a whole lot of research in different areas of psychology, if this is something that interests you. Psychosomatic medicine emphasizes the role of psychological factors in disease, that how does stress and other psychological factors lead to disease. Health psychology emphasizes the psychological influences on health. How do we use psychological techniques to get somebody to stop smoking or exercise more or things like that? So it's using what we know about psychology to influence health. How do we get people to take medications they need to take every day? Things like that. Psychoneuroimmunology, that's the study of the interaction between the immune system and other organs, including our brain and our emotions. We see that long stressful periods suppress the immune system and leave people more vulnerable to different diseases and getting sick. And you can see in this chart, children who are bullied, either verbally or physically, are at greater risk for mental and physical disorders later in life. And these effects of bullying are just as strong as the effects of physical or sexual abuse. So again, the stress and chronic stress particularly leads to greater risk for mental disorders as well as physical disorders. And that's that combination of psychosomatic or neuroimmunology, that it's all works together. Our brain and our body all work together to either protect us or potentially put us at risk. We also see high cortisol levels for a long period of time impair memory. And perhaps this prolonged high level of cortisol again being the stress hormone, increases vulnerability of neurons in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an important part of our brain when we talk about memory. And so cortisol may be responsible for deterioration of the hippocampus, leading to higher cortisol levels, and more hippocampal levels becomes kind of this vicious cycle. And you can see that older people with the highest cortisol levels tend to have the smallest hippocampus and the greatest memory problems. So again, cortisol, or a stress hormone, in a small dose for a specific event, when you have a stressful situation, it's important. We need that cortisol and that epinephrine and norepinephrine to get us through whatever that stressful emotion is or that stressful situation is. And it's actually helpful. But over a long period of time, someone who is in chronic stress that they can't get out of, a child in an abusive home, a person who is lost their job, struggling to find food, doesn't have a place to live, doesn't have support, social support. It's this long-term chronic stress that seems to be bad for us in many ways. All right, everybody, thank you so much.